serve as the basically field organizing coordinator for the National Move to Amend campaign. And George, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm George Friday. I'm also on the executive committee for Move to Amend, representing the Independent Progressive Politics Network, and I'm thrilled to be able to do this today.
Cool. And I should have said I'm in Eureka, California, and George is home, right, in Gastonia, North Carolina.
Right.
Yo! Okay, we are at the office, so there's a new pile of brochures which showed up, and they are over there.
Hey!
I'm into, we got 15,000 new brochures, so place an order if you need one. So we haven't done the video before, but we thought with this topic that might be a good thing, so we're trying it out, and hopefully everything will work. But you can hear through your phone, and hopefully you can see. The most important thing is being able to see the PowerPoint and mostly hear. So even if the video is a little funky, we'll still be able to push through. Just to orient anybody who hasn't done one of these webinars before, you can see the participant list on the left-hand side, and you can type your questions in the chat bar at the bottom, and Alana Stewart is here. Alana! And she is helping field the questions, and we'll also have time for you to ask questions of George and myself, but Alana will be fielding them as we go. And if you're having any major difficulties, you could try the support at anymeeting.com, which is the service we use, which generally is pretty good. But hopefully seems like everyone's doing all right. So I did want to just really quickly, can I borrow this from you for 1 second? Just get a sense of who's here. So there's on your screen, you should be seeing a poll asking what your involvement with Move to Amend is. So if you wouldn't mind just filling that out so we can get a sense. And George, you should be able to see the responses on your screen too, to just know whether folks are already involved with Move to Amend groups or whether they're brand new, because these webinars are open to anyone, but we gear the subjects for our local affiliates. So it looks like the majority of people here are already connected with a Move to Amend affiliate, and that's great. It looks like we don't have any brand new folks, so that's good. That's helpful.
Did I vote?
No, don't worry about it. You can actually stop the voting and close it out. Cool. Thanks. All right. Yeah. So obviously we can't get very far into this topic in just an hour. Maybe we'll go an hour, 15 minutes or so. But we are just going to do a quick overview, and really it's geared towards helping you think about how you could get started. So we're going to talk some about Move to Amend's principles and why we're even talking about reaching out to communities of color and anti-racism the way that we are. Then we're going to talk about some stuff that you can do to get started, because we really see it as important to do some internal work in an initial way and also ongoing way to be able to be equipped to be an anti-racist ally and to work on anti-racism. And then as part of that, we're going to define some terms, which is helpful. And then we're going to talk about some first steps you can take, both having a conversation in your group as a whole and then also towards building new relationships, and then show you an exercise. And so in terms of Move to Amend, I took our statement of values from our website, which you can find on our site under the section on the Move to Amend Coalition. All of you are already connected with Move to Amend in some way or another, so I won't belabor this, but just to remind us all that we're committed to accountability and responsibility, both personally and organizationally. We really value transparency and community, and we see movement building as essential for not just how we do our work, but also in some ways the goal is to build a strong democracy movement in the United States that is connected with the democracy movement globally. Move to Amend's mission of abolishing corporate personhood and money as speech and democratizing our legal system are all very important. And then the last one that we're going to be focusing on today is a commitment to anti-oppression within ourselves, our communities, our workplaces, the policies that we have as Move to Amend, and then ideally we're extending them into our work elsewhere too, and representation in leadership. And so we just really feel as though from a strategic perspective, obviously from a justice perspective, when we're talking about corporations not being people and driving them out of the Constitution, we also have to have as a, as an equal value that all people should be seen as people and have, full rights under the Constitution and just also culturally. But we also see it as a strategic reason as well. We aren't going to be able to win this thing unless we're able to build alliances and relationships and movements that do not just include, one class of people or one race of people, but that really are express the multitude of movements that are already doing work and that take this up as well. And so we need to figure out how to do that. And there have been moments in our history where, people have come together and they were really powerful moments. But on the whole, a lot of our activism is segregated along racial lines. And so that's a lot of why we focus on race in particular. But we're talking about all these principles can apply to anti-oppression in general. George, is there anything you want to add to any of that?
No, I think you've covered it all, Caitlin. Thanks.
Okay.
Hey, and covered the rationale for this really well. So I'm really just going to jump into how do we get started and the importance of starting with your internal work. It's not surprising when you think about the fact that we're not encouraged to talk about issues of difference in race or class or sexual identity or religion, because there is motivation for those who want to maintain status quo power and status quo relationships, especially around money and power, to keep us separate. And as Caitlin said, as we're trying to make sure corporations are out of our Constitution, it's really important to think about the struggles and the histories of people and classes, including women and people with disabilities and other groups that are working to get in the Constitution and be recognized there. So these aren't conversations that we're comfortable with, but if you've made a decision based on your principles, based on your values, that you want to work for, in particular, racial justice and an end to oppression, then that's a decision that's will affect the rest of your life. Given that this is work that is lifelong, it really makes sense to relax a little bit. Give yourself a break. Give people around you a break. Understand that this is not an issue area where any of us have a lot of comfort. All of us who are learning about it are, building the path as we go along, even those of us who've had decades of experience doing anti-oppression and anti-racism work. So we first start with what have we been conditioned to believe, and imagine, I bet a number of you are excellent gardeners, and this is the time of year for some decent gardening. I've been doing some myself. Well, imagine all of the things that have to be absolutely weeded out of that garden so that we can plant deeply some lessons and some experiences around anti-oppression. So even though we've been conditioned not to think of it and not to be comfortable talking about it, not to be comfortable when someone even brings it up, that's something that we can work into. And the simplest way to do that is through building relationships. Building relationships with someone who doesn't reflect the community of origin that you grew up in, may not reflect the culture of origin that you know most familiar with. So it is work, but the quality of the relationships that you build are phenomenal. The depth of commitment that you'll get as you move from your internal work to working within your group and working within your community to really broaden and deepen the players, the stakeholders, as it were, in building a true democracy movement, you'll have folks that will be in it, for the rest of their lives. I mean, really committed to doing this work. That's the movement building piece. That's when we get to the place where we can really win. We're building power. We're building a movement. You can't be denied when you get that kind of strength. So I guess the only other thing I would add in terms of kind of thinking about really rolling on this work. So it's the rest of your life. Relax. There's plenty to learn. There are plenty of mistakes that you can make and you will make. No one's judging you. You wouldn't step out to do this work unless you were serious. So we're going to seriously support the development of great work and great movement. So relax in that sense. And it is hard work. The other thing is, while we are all learners around this issue, even those of us who've been doing it for decades, there are some things we've really figured out. So it doesn't have to be an onerous task where you start from square one. There are some very simple ways, basically in the context of building community, that you can reach out, work with communities of color, work with communities that may not have the same kind of privilege that you have, and really make a stronger movement. So, do we want to have any questions right now?
Sure, if you want to pause for a second. So if you have questions, you can chat them. And
we've got like 4 minutes, I think, Caitlin.
Okay, great. Thanks, George.
So, questions. Oh, I see where they would be. Okay. Thanks, Alana.
Mm-hmm. Looks like we might be all right. Obviously, it takes a second to check.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thanks for putting those assumptions up. A lot of those are what I just shared when I was talking. You can see those. Yes, it is a general introduction, Phyllis. And you can see in the assumptions here that we put up, a lot of these are what I was just sort of walking y'all through, and this is the kind of thing you can use with your group because, again, you want to underscore with people that this isn't an issue any of us are really comfortable with. We're all bringing lessons to it.
Right, and we're also assuming that even if there are folks in your affiliate who are, experienced, even trainers on this topic potentially, that doesn't mean that everybody in your group has had that kind of background, and so you don't want to assume that folks have or haven't, and no matter what, as a Move to Amend group, you can't be more than 2 years old. And if you're from a partner that is older, you still probably have new folks coming into your group. And so it's important not to just assume that everybody knows all this stuff and everybody's talking about the same thing when we use different words, and that, this has all been taken care of. Because as George said, this is an ongoing, if we had really figured this out, then we wouldn't be in this mess. So clearly we haven't all figured it out. And so that means that stopping and pausing and having some intentional conversation, both, to get to know each other a little bit better and know what some of your background is and what you're bringing to the table, but also to think strategically about how to be more intentional as Move to Amend in your community to make sure that you are building relationships with not just the folks that you already know, but beyond, is important and is a strategic conversation that is important to have. And if you don't carve out the time for it, you're probably going to find yourself focusing more on where can we petition and how do we get media and those sorts of things that are more often where we're steered towards. And so it's important to carve out the time to do it and not to make assumptions that everybody's already all finished with it.
Do you have another question?
Also, if you move forward with where can we petition and how can we get more media, and you're not at least at the same time, broadening and deepening the people that are in your group and the kind of communities that you're connected to, you'll find yourself leaving people out and getting to the point where, wow, we really now need to engage lots of young people or lots of low-income people or lots of people that are involved in Occupy, and they're not here now. And at some point for those folks, it does feel too late to feel like you're significantly engaged. And it is really just about engaging folks in as many ways as you can, as soon as you can into the process.
So George, there are some questions, but my suggestion, because they kind of, I think, would be better to talk about them after we've gone through some of this stuff. So if Alana, you could hold on to those, and maybe we could keep moving, get through some of the definitions first, and then take the rest of these questions and any others that folks have. The other thing that I just wanted to say is a lot of these principles are helpful, not just talking about reaching out with to and with communities of color, but anybody that you don't already have relationships with, or that you're not, coming from the exact same place as. So George already said a lot of these things. Is there anything, Georgia, that you want to add in terms of the building bridges slide?
Not at all.
Okay, great. So language is really important because the language, for a number of reasons, and this is something that not just when talking about racism or oppression, but just in general, the language that we use actually shapes how we think and see the world. This is certainly one of the things that also ties into perpetuating corporate dominance is, the language that we use and that we've internalized. So it's really important to understand language in terms of combating oppression for that reason, because we might be perpetuating something unintentionally, but also because lots of times one of the things that makes talking about racism particularly difficult, or other kinds of oppressions, is that the same words mean different things to different people. So you might be saying something and you might unknowingly be offending someone, or somebody may have no idea what you're talking about. So we always kind of start with language as a foundation for, what do we mean at Move to Amend when we're talking about these issues. And hopefully this conversation that we're having with you is something that you can take back with your group and use this, again, to build a foundation for your group, for your organization on anti-oppression. And it's important to note that the definitions that we're going to give you, these are the definitions from our perspective. And they are not the same as what you would find in the dictionary, and that's not an accident. Obviously, I'm talking to a group of Move to Amend folks, so I don't think I need to say that, the people who define the words in this society are those who hold the power, and as George said before, there's an interest on the part of those power holders to maintain the status quo, and in fact, to remove power from the rest of us. And so we need to remember that we have the power and the authority and the legitimacy to define words in a way that works for us, so that we can create justice and that we can name oppression rather than keeping it invisible, which is what a lot of the power structure does when it comes to oppression. It tries to make it invisible, tries to make it normalized, and tries to make it so that it's harder for us to talk about it and name it when it's there. And so we need to use language that removes those barriers. All right,
so we're going to go through some definitions of just some of the terms that we think will help, especially with your group, to think about these issues. So oppression. Oppression is a systemic exploitation of one group by another for its own benefit, for the benefit of one group over another. So this is about institutional control, ideological domination, imposing the dominant group's culture on the oppressed group. Now, oppression is different than discrimination, bias, prejudice, or bigotry in some significant ways. Some of those are that oppression is pervasive. It's woven throughout all of the social institutions, as well as embedded within our individual consciousness. Often I say to people, it's like the air we breathe. It's here. We don't have to invite it. We don't have to consciously make it part of our our thinking and our culture. It's there. So it's also restricting. There's structural limits that significantly shape a person's life, their life chances, and their sense of their possibilities in ways beyond the individual's control. People talk about cycles of oppression in terms of especially poverty. And that is, conditions of oppression that could be generational without any ways to really get out of that, especially in a psychological way. Oppression is hierarchical. The dominant or the privileged groups benefit, often in very unconscious ways, as we said, from the disempowerment of subordinated or targeted group. Under oppression, the dominant group has the power to define and name reality and determine what's normal, real, or correct. Think about this yourself, and this isn't, as many things around oppression, naming it is not an accusation of guilt or an indictment of any kind, but imagine the times that you say, you're in a conversation and you say, you know, people, da-da-da-da-da, and you really mean white people, or you really mean people from a certain neighborhood or with a certain education background. Again, nothing slight about you, because we all do this, but often, you know, you'll just say that. Normal often is defined by the dominant group. Oppression is also different but from discrimination, bias, prejudice, or bigotry, because harassment, discrimination, marginalization are systemic. They're institutionalized. They do not require the conscious thought or effort of an individual members of a dominant group, but rather it's sort of part is business as usual. So our biases are personal. Oppression is systemic.
So the next word is racism, and while your screen is catching up, I'll just start it. Racism is racial and cultural prejudice and discrimination that's supported intentionally or unintentionally by institutionalized power and authority that's used to advantage one race and disadvantage other races. So the critical element which differentiates racism from prejudice and discrimination is the use of institutionalized power and authority to support those prejudices and enforce discriminatory behaviors in systemic far-reaching ways and outcomes and effects. So all people have some biases and prejudices. It doesn't matter what race you are. All people have that. It's sort of built in some ways in terms of the way we categorize things. But we're defining racism as different than those prejudices because it is coupled with institutional power and authority. And so really under that definition in our society, not just in the United States, but really globally on the whole, it is impossible for anybody except for white people to benefit from racism, or for white people are, you know, the only ones who have those privileges that racism brings. Again, we could certainly come up with ways where people have biases, but that institutional power and authority really sets up a white supremacist system, and we'll talk about that definition in just a sec, too.
The next definition is privilege. Like prejudice, everyone has privilege in some ways. So privilege are the benefits automatically received from being a member of a dominant group. It includes not having to think about the implication of one's identity because of automatically fitting in the category that's the norm or the standard for the society. The advantages created for members of the dominant group are often invisible to them, or they are considered rights available to everyone as opposed to privileges awarded only to some individuals and groups. So there's white skin privilege. There's the privilege of being a U.S. citizen, the privilege of being able-bodied, the privilege of being college educated or having enough money to pay the bills. So those are all privileges.
So I already mentioned white supremacy. The definition that we give for it is that it's an ideology or philosophy that holds that white culture and attitudes, behavior, beliefs, standards, history, values, etc., are superior to all others, and that they're the standard by which everyone must meet. And in the United States, white supremacy and racism, which we use as two interchangeably sometimes, has been embedded in the foundations of all major institutions. White supremacy requires members of other races to assimilate into white culture, thereby accepting the invalidation of their own culture, history, values, etc. And I put in here, too, that it doesn't necessarily mean only the Ku Klux Klan. I think that the definition that we're given in the dictionary or in school is the idea that white supremacy is the Ku Klux Klan, and certainly that is, you know, the most far end of it in terms of attitudes, beliefs, standards, and values as being superior. But the part that is more insidious and more less acknowledged by, you know, the status quo or the dictionary or what have you is this business of whiteness being the standard for all other groups to meet, and in order to be accepted and to gain the privileges, you have to assimilate. And sometimes those privileges are not available regardless, but sometimes they can be acquired or attained if assimilation happens. But the piece that comes with that is, whether consciously or unconsciously, a rejection of your own culture, history, and values. So obviously, that means that we are in a white supremacist culture, even if we're not in the Deep South, in a situation where, people have family members that are Klan members. This is something that goes on everywhere, no matter where we are, or what our background and our culture is, if we're involved with U.S. culture. And even if we're not white, there's still white supremacy.
All right. So sexism, the cultural, institutional, and individual set of beliefs and practices that privilege men, subordinate women, and denigrate values and practices associated with women.
And then the last one we wanted to do, and we should have said this at the beginning, these are not even all the definitions that we use, in trainings, or certainly that are out there when you're talking about oppression. We just chose 5, I think, or maybe it was 6 to focus in on, but certainly it's not an exhaustive list, and if you would like the full list so that you can talk about it as a whole with your group, we can certainly provide that. But the last one that we're going to just put out there is classism, which is the institutional, cultural, and individual set of practices and beliefs that assign differential values to people according to their socioeconomic class. And it's also an economic system which creates excessive inequality and causes basic human needs to go unmet. So actually, before we go to the next one, I'm going to leave it on this slide. And we wanted to take some time to talk about this a little bit. And in fact, to kind of model what some of the questions that might come up if you were to have a conversation using these definitions just as the basis for a conversation with your group. Well, I won't say anything about that because somebody might ask about it. But our suggestion is that you could just use these to talk about it and see what folks think and what their reaction is and what their response is, and that might be a really good way to begin some of the conversation. So, if there's what are your responses? What are your thoughts or reactions or questions as we went through these definitions? And you can type them to Alana, and then she'll. We can both kind of see them as long as I look over here, but we have to read them actually, so that.
And imagine doing this with your group. Taking 30 minutes or so to go through the definitions. What do you think would come up? What would be some of the questions you'd want to discuss?
Obviously, I know it's easier to talk than it is to type sometimes, so sorry for the technology, but this conference call service doesn't let us do the other one, so either everyone would be on talking at the same time or everyone's on mute. So I'm going to read Phyllis's question because for the recording they won't be able to see this. So in terms of responding to what the group might say, why are we going through this? Let's get to the problem that we're working on.
Okay, and I think, Phyllis, one way to start with that is to encourage people or invite them to think about what it's going to take to win on the problem that we're working on. What is it going to take for us to have a democracy movement that results in a constitution that has meaning for everyone in the country and an elected body that we can hold accountable? When you start doing the math and start thinking about what that's going to take, we're going to have enough bodies on our side, and the best way to do that is to reach out to people who have been affected negatively by the consequences of corporate rule. So those are communities of color, low-income communities, people who have been marginalized by decades of oppression driven by corporate greed.
And then I would just add in that, so then the second piece of that, I think, is that in terms of thinking about how to start building relationships with folks, if you go through history, you can see the ways that, we have been divided artificially and intentionally around issues of race, especially in this country, to make it harder for us to come together to fight for our rights. And so if we're talking about how to come together and get beyond that, it's not something that's just going to happen because, we blink our eyes and we want it to. We actually need to put some work and some effort into it. And going back on what George said about how this is the air we breathe, we breathe the air of white supremacy and racism here in the United States. We're brought up with it from, the moment that we start interacting with people, sometimes overtly, but lots of times not overtly. And so if we're not intentional about undoing some of that air and being, kind of like a fish in water that can't see the water and doesn't even know that it's there, we are going to make mistakes. We are going to perpetuate oppressions that we've been taught, and we're not going to be able to build meaningful relationships. We will have too many stumbles, and if we're, again, thinking about this strategically, we don't really have time to not get this right. And while on one hand it is our whole lives, on the other hand this is critical importance. And so I kind of think of it as like with anything, first you strategize about how you're going to go forward. First you do some learning before you figure out how you're going to move, and then you try some things, and then you assess them. And that's what movement building is, period, when any aspect that you're talking about. And so this is another piece of that. And we have to be aware that that we're taught language and we're taught culture, and even if we're trying to do something different, if we're not putting in the time to be intentional about that, it's going to be really hard, because the second we step outside of ourselves, it's there to greet us.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. I think that's an excellent way to just sort of keep folks on the track there. There's another question about if the problem, and I guess the problem of corporate personhood and corporate rule is not even on the radar of people of color. How do we get them the opportunity to see, hear, and experience what we are seeing, hearing, or feeling? It's not that it's not on the radar. It's different language. If you talk to people in communities of color about what's happening with their kids in junior high and high school, it's about forcing them to either choose prison or choose the military. Who's driving that? That's all driven by corporate greed. If you follow the money or you look at the root causes of most of the problems in communities of color, whether that's living in a food desert like people in Detroit, Michigan, or parts of LA where there's no grocery store, there's no food, that's the root of that is corporate greed. If you look at what's going on with healthcare or education or housing, all of the issues that are real bread and butter issues for low-income communities and communities of color, there's a connecting the dots that can be done to what's going on with corporations and corporations overstepping. So, but that's not even the beginning, though. The beginning is just initiating those relationships. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that happens, but it's not a big leap. None of this work is as complicated or as difficult as you might imagine. It really is as simple as beginning relationships with people who are already having their butts kicked by what's going on, and when you connect with the work they're doing and what Move to Amend is doing, it becomes a very logical fit. It becomes a very meaningful set of work, and with people, so that you are having a movement and really expanding your numbers in an exponential way with folks that are easier to reach out to than maybe folks who are very conservative or more right-wing. Because people who are more conservative, more right-wing, even if they're civil libertarians, on the justice front might not be with you. Whereas folks who have needed justice for a minute will be right there very quickly.
The other thing, too, is that I think it's important to remember that we're not necessarily asking folks to sit down the work. I mean, we're not, not necessarily. We can't be asking folks to set down the work that they're already doing to support and aid communities that are at the margins because they're hit hardest by corporate rule. And so it's not like we're asking them to take on this constitutional amendment effort instead of work around foreclosure or instead of work around food security or instead of work around voting rights. It's more that we're trying to tie this in and show how this amendment will help all of us if we build the movement right. And so we can be practicing solidarity, which means that we need to be in solidarity with those struggles too. And sometimes folks have asked about some of the emails that we've sent out that seem like they're peripheral to what we're working on. But for us, they're not peripheral because that's part of what's needed to build those relationships, and we're trying to do it at the national level. Those of us who have taken on the task of doing Move to Amend National, we need to show those expressions of solidarity in a meaningful way to support the work that is happening and show how it is connected. It is a symptom of corporate rule. And then the other piece is that this is also part of why it's so important that we make sure to be clear that this constitutional amendment is not about Citizens United. It's just not. Citizens United is the latest symptom, but in the money and politics realm of corporate rule. But this is not the only piece, and it's a good thing that so many people woke up as a result of it. But then our work is to show how it is just the latest symptom and how the problem didn't start with Citizens United, and those who feel impacted by Citizens United are only the tip of the iceberg of people who have been struggling with issues of corporate rule for, generations and generations.
Got it, Caitlin. We also need to pivot to our next agenda item so that we can mostly stay on task. Yes, money is filthy. Okay, so getting started. You want to get started with your own group, and we have some suggestions. Certainly, at the beginning of the conversation we had here, going through some of the assumptions, we have a handout for some guidelines for the conversation, and in many ways, normalizing this conversation with your group is something that needs to happen as well. So start a conversation with your group, thinking about what do you want to get out of the conversation, and one place is helping people to just get a level of comfort in engaging with the issue, being able to see strategically what this is about, and be able to talk to that with each other. So if your conversation accomplishes nothing but helping to understand why our affiliate will be stronger with people who English isn't their first language, or people who are struggling to not be thrown out of their house, or folks who have been dealing with discrimination or racial profiling in my town or my county. You want to really start by knowing that you need to have the skill set to be able to comfortably talk to those folks, to comfortably go to a meeting that's about foreclosures, and your only role in being there in the meeting about foreclosures is to listen, is to figure out and find ways that your affiliate might be able to support what they're doing, show up at a hearing, or be on a picket line or a march with folks, and build that kind of relationship. So you want to have real clear goals for your group, and make sure that all of the leaders in your affiliate are participating in that conversation. What do you need to be able to have that conversation with people in terms of any handouts or suggestions or resources for them? And at the end of the conversation, what do you want to have accomplished? Again, my suggestion for the first conversation is just developing a level of comfort with this. But over time, you want to help people have a set of cultural competencies so they can go to a meeting that's primarily led by folks who are not from your community of origin. Represent, move to amend, and start to build those relationships. So that's a good way to start.
So that's a good segue to this next part about starting to initiate some of those relationships. So as we said at the beginning, our suggestion is that, part of what you need to do is have a conversation about this internally with your group, maybe a few conversations, and think of it as one, get to know each other will come out, but also it's a strategic conversation. It has a strategic purpose. It's about trying to identify, who's not in the room, whose voices should be, whether people are going to actually start coming to your meetings or not, is sort of depends on how whether that works within their agenda and the work that's already happening in your community. But still, if you have no idea what is going on in the Latino community in your town, then you're not very well equipped to be working with them. So, identifying where your holes are, and then also talking about, how you're going to start to develop those relationships. So some ideas, things that you need for groundwork is, you want to make sure that you normalize talking about oppression in all your meetings and your settings. This is important in part because if you're going to have folks who are new folks who start coming to your meetings as a result of some of your relationships and outreach, they need to be able to feel comfortable. They need to be able to feel as though if there are issues, and there will be, that they can be brought up and that they can be talked about, and that otherwise they're just going to go away and find something else to do because it's not going to be worth their time. So another piece of that is creating a culture of inclusion and making sure that your meetings are accessible and doing some intentional work around what does accessibility mean, in particular as it relates to who you're trying to work with. Does it mean that you need to have translation? Does it mean that you need to have childcare because working folks can't afford to get a babysitter in order to be able to come to meetings? What time are your meetings and where are they held? Are they on a bus line? All those kinds of questions about just being intentional about how to make sure that the folks who you would like to be able to come, who you're inviting to come, actually can be there. Because otherwise it sends a mixed message. And then starting to also actually develop some of those relationships by talking to folks. So as George said, maybe going to a meeting, maybe you have come up with a list of other organizations that are doing great work in your community, but you don't know anything about them. You don't know who they are, and you don't know what work they're actually doing and how you could be helpful and how you could be connecting their issues to this constitutional amendment effort. So going to a meeting to find out what's going on, definitely introduce yourself, don't be the weird skulker in the corner, but then being there to listen and not to go and give a presentation about how folks should be working on the constitutional amendment campaign, but rather just letting them know that you're there because you're interested in their work and you are from Move to Amend, and Move to Amend is interested in supporting their work and finding out how you might be able to work together down the road, and that you're there to observe and listen, and that you're going to take it back to your group. So my other ideas are initiating a one-on-one meeting with a leader from another group or community. So finding out, it doesn't look like there's anyone from Salem here, but our Salem affiliate, one of the leaders in that group, Carrie, who some of you know, did this. She initiated a meeting with a Latino organization's executive director, took him to coffee, and just had a conversation with him about some of the work that they're doing. And this past May Day, Move to Amend Salem did the security for their big rally of the other group as a way to support. They weren't, front and center. They didn't ask for an opportunity to be the keynote speaker at the march, but they were listed on the program, and actually, as part of that whole process, some of their materials were actually translated into Spanish that were going to be on the program talking about what Move to Amend was, because this other organization started to see Move to Amend in Salem as a partner and somebody that they were willing to put some resources into supporting as well. Extending a special invitation to your events. I know, I can't remember who it was, but somebody on a recent call just let us know that she made an effort based on some real minimal relationships that she already had through some friends of some of the leadership in a very important Black church that was in the neighboring community. And she just made sure to extend a special invitation, not by email, but actually with a phone call, and say, you know, we're doing this event and we'd really love if you all could come, and we'd like to invite you. And that made a big difference and was just really warmly received, because that wasn't something that normally happened from groups that was in the community where she was from. And whether or not folks actually are able to attend because they have a busy plate too, in a lot of ways, even just extending that invitation and doing it in a way that's not just the typical, you know, here's the blast email, but actually a phone call or a letter or an in-person invitation can go a long way towards showing that you actually care and are interested in developing that relationship. Conducting a listening session, that's something that you might do with other community groups and actually make it an actual campaign. Some of you all, you know, have said, well, how does this issue relate? Well, folks know their own situation best, and so rather than guessing, maybe asking people, and you might need to use different words than corporate personhood, and that would be true whether you're talking about communities of color or, you know, any other people out there who are maybe not as politically engaged, but are engaged in other ways, but asking, you know, about what is going on in their community or in their neighborhoods, what issues they're facing, and then doing some of the work yourself to be able to draw those connections. Or you might get some really good gems and folks who could tell you explicitly and answer your question themselves. And then also thinking about doing outreach in neighborhood or communities that you don't normally reach out to. So whether that is the petitioning that you're doing or the canvassing that you're doing, being sure to expand where you are and who you're talking to, but then also being prepared to ask questions and listen and not just give your spiel. And this is why I say that these principles are useful no matter who you're talking about, really, because this is universally true for people that, you know, if you're going to just show up and say, get involved with my thing, somebody who's already doing work, I mean, think about if somebody did that with you. You know, your answer would probably be, great, I may think that your work is really important, but I'm already doing something and I don't have time. Or on the other end of it, it might be like, who are you? And why should I care about what you're talking about? So these are sort of universal principles, but remembering to be intentional about them, to be humble, because you are trying to get over some of these divides that have been put here and that work against us, and you're trying to acknowledge that they're there and show that you have a commitment towards overcoming them. Do you have anything to add, George?
Not exactly. I do want us to pause here before we go to the next piece, but no, I don't have any more to add. I just want to say a little, give a little example of some of the work that we want to do. So is this time for that?
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know if it's an example so much, but trying to really illustrate why working with communities of color and people dealing with oppression really will be helpful. And there's a story it reminded me of that if you imagine, there are two women who are standing by a river, and they're talking with each other, and one of them notices a baby going by in the river, and she jumps in the river and takes the baby out, and before she even gets out of the river, there's another baby that goes by, so she grabs that one. The woman on the shore grabs her neighbor, and she comes over, and there's these babies coming down the river, and these women start taking the babies down the river. And after a while, one of the women stops, and she goes, you know, I'm going to go upriver and find out where these babies are coming from. To a large extent, we know that overrule of corporations is what's sending the babies in the river. There are folks that have to be taking the babies out of the river all the time because there's so many coming down and more than they can catch. Part of your challenge in building relationships with people who are taking the babies out of the river is to both help them take some of those babies out of the river while you're helping them to realize that, if we go upstream, we can stop these babies from ever getting in the river in the first place. So I hope that makes a little sense. It always did for me in terms of why we do this work and why we both have to be at the head of the river, stopping what's going on, and that's stopping corporate rule, talking to folks at every stage down the river to help the babies get out, and help folks who are rushing to the river to help the babies to realize that, wait a minute, go upriver and put your energy there in addition to river energy here or instead of energy there. Hope that makes some sense. I don't know if it does, but I wanted to share it. And it's quick. We're still on time. So here's an exercise that y'all can use with folks. So you're going to have these conversations with your group, and here's a really good exercise that one of the things that no one brought up as a question, but certainly something that people can think about is, so what if we step to these folks who are trying to get babies out of the river and they're trying to stop their homes from being foreclosed, or a library in their neighborhood from being closed, or dealing with the young kid who got beat up by the police? What if we go in there and they say, we don't want to see you, we don't want to be dealing with you, what are we going to do? You may not get the most wonderful initial welcome if you step to people as if you're the expert, as if you're doing them a favor. But if you step to people with a real consciousness about the potential of building partnership and a movement, and a real willingness to listen more than you talk, you'll be really surprised by the reaction that you get. This exercise, Bubbles and Bricks, is one that will help you not fall into what can be a pitfall that often happens when especially white folks or folks with financial privilege talk to low-income folks or people of color. What can happen is, because we all want to relate to other folks, we will share an experience that we've had that feels like oppression. So I can relate to being an undocumented person because of blank that happened in my past, or I can relate to being a black person because of blank that happened in my family. And often that can be not experienced by people who are dealing with oppression so well, because there's a difference between personal pain and oppression. And a memory that's stored as a bubble, something that, you think about the past, you think about some of the things you've experienced that have not been good experiences, and some of them might have been horrible. You may have grown up in a household where one of the adults was drug dependent or alcohol dependent, and that was devastating for your life growing up. There may have been violence in your childhood growing up, or abject poverty. All of those conditions can feel oppressive. Some of them are oppression, but what's different about those memories may be how you store them. So a memory that you think of that kind of floats outside of yourself and then kind of pops like a bubble is that. It's a bubble. It doesn't weigh you down or hurt you or stay with you for a long time. So that's what a bubble is. Other memories you may think about may be stored as when you think about a memory and it seems kind of far off, but then you start to think about it and suddenly it's in your face, really vivid, like it just happened, almost like a strong smell that takes your breath away. People have some memories like that. Often if you've been physically abused or sexually abused in your past, been in a situation where your emotional and psychological stability is at risk, some kind of chronic conditions of real abuse, then that can be a scent. And that's how the memory is. It comes on you really fast, and then like somebody opened the door and a wind came, it's gone. It's gone. It's a scent, it's gone. Another way you might store a memory is something that happened that often, this is things that don't feel good, but something that you store as a brick. You think about this memory and you're immediately just weighed down. You sink your shoulders, it makes you tired to think about it. It's a devastating memory. Often those are memories connected to oppression. Someone, said a racial slur or said something derogatory about women, so something very sexist or very racist that really stuck with you. Sometimes bricks are things that you use as weapons of other people. So someone does something really horribly racist to me, and I do something really horribly prejudiced to a person who's South Asian or from another country or a different age, and I do something horrible to them and say a racial epithet or something. But the brick stays with you. Sadly, you can't get rid of them by throwing them away. They're still there. The other ways that sometimes people store memories is as eggs. These are also, like scents, often memories connected to chronic pain, conditions of oppression or personal pain. And people have, over time, made these memories be connected somehow to how they define themselves. This often happens to people who've been a victim for a long time of maybe abuse from their intimate partners or in their background, but have come to see themselves connected to that memory of trauma or pain, and they hold it like it's part of who they are, and they value it. So that's an egg. So those are different ways you might think of a memory. The exercise works like this. You ask folks to get a sheet of paper, and on the sheet of paper they will have 3 columns. The first column, you'll list an experience that you went through that just didn't feel good. You don't have to go through a lot of emotions for this exercise. You don't have to unearth anything deep. It's all in your head. It's completely in your head. So what's the memory? Wasn't a good one? Something that happened with a teacher or on the school bus or with your family or at a church or at a family event. And then you list the event and then think about, does it feel like that was personal pain or oppression? We've gotten the definition of oppression tonight. We've talked about oppression. Personal pain is something that happens. It can feel oppressive, but it's finite. If you're raised in a household where somebody's beating you every time they get drunk or they shoot up or whatever it is, that person's going to grow up to die. It's finite. Or you're going to move from the house. Even if you grew up in abject poverty, you may get in conditions where you're no longer in poverty anymore. Your income is balanced. You might even have trust funds or lots of money. So that is, while oppression is also finite. So personal pain ends. It's also something that you can end by yourself. If you're a child dealing with an adult who's abusing you in some way or even someone bullying you, 1 or 2 other people can stop that. You can tell a trusted adult, you can tell a policeman, you can tell a teacher, you can tell a priest or a minister, and that abuse, that harassment can stop. So personal pain is finite. You can stop it by yourself sometime or with the help of a few people. Oppression is institutional. It's chronic. You're always going to be a woman. You're always going to be a person of color. You're always going to be someone who's non-documented unless we change the laws in this country. So that kind of oppression is not going to go away. And the only way you can counter it is with a movement, is by changing laws. Not just changing someone's behavior or calling the police. We got to change the Constitution. So that's the difference between oppression and personal pain. So the point of doing the exercise is you write down the incident, then you write down, does that feel like personal pain, oppression, or both? Some things are absolutely both. And then how did you store the memory? With the goal of being able to store all the memories as bubbles. We want all the memories to just be, yeah, it happened, it sucked, but it's out there. It's not affecting who I am. It's not affecting how I bring myself to new relationships. Certainly not affecting how I can be a good ally. Isn't this yours, Caitlin?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there are a lot of things out there, good materials on being a good ally, and if you want to just even do an internet search on anti-racist ally or feminist ally, you can find other principles. But this is part of what we mean by being clear that part of the work is the solidarity with others, and we all have an obligation, if those of us who do have privilege in different ways, to be allies to those who are not able to access that institutionalized privilege in whatever ways, whether we're men or white or more affluent class-wise or more able-bodied, whatever it may be. So to be an ally to members of other oppressed groups, we need to get our heads around knowing that we're good enough and smart enough to be a good ally, to assume that other members of the other to assume that members of the other group are experts in their own experience and that we have a lot to learn from them, to be prepared for conflicts and confrontation now and then, and to acknowledge and admit and apologize for mistakes and to learn from them, and to acknowledge that they will be made, and that's okay, but they're learning opportunities. To learn about the issues that are important to the other group, not in a way that just plays lip service, but actually is genuine and real. To not expect gratitude from those folks that you're being an ally to. Being an ally is your choice. Certainly it can be hard work, and so finding other allies of that same kind of group, that, you know, other white folks to support each other in being allies, other men to support each other in being feminist allies, is important. And it's hard to go it on your own, but to be clear that, you know, gratitude is not going to come from people of color. Gratitude is not going to come from women to men, and nor should it, because it's a choice, and is what we should be doing. And to develop really good listening skills and practice those more than anything else. To be humble about listening and having a lot to learn. So like I said, there are a lot of other materials and resources, and actually a couple really good ones that I pulled together to just share with you right now. There are some materials in the Move to Amend toolkit, and we're adding to those and expanding those. So I'll add the bubbles and bricks exercise, and we also have a spectrum that I've been meaning to put up and haven't had a chance to do that yet. And so when I put up the materials for this webinar, I'll make sure that that goes up there too, where you can do an assessment, and it's a good tool to use for talking with your group about kind of where you are on the spectrum of working towards racial integration in a multicultural society that, you know, is not racist, etc., and in your own internal culture as well. So I'll put those in the Move to Amend toolkit, and I will also send them out with the recording and the slides that we always send to everybody who's a participant on each one of the webinars. And then some other really good resources include Organizing for Power, Organizing for Change is really well set up with lots of different categories. It's a blog website, but it's really set up to give you resources, and it's specific to around organizing. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that, or maybe as a group have homework between, you know, a couple of your meetings that everyone's going to comb through it, and then bring to the next meeting some gems that you find that would be helpful for your organizing work around organizing against oppression too. And there's a link to this that's in the Move to Amend toolkit. And then Colors of Resistance has some good anti-oppression organizing tools, as does Training for Change. And Training for Change, in particular, the link that I put right here, and then some of the stuff that they have in their in this section of their website, talks about why is this important, why this is actually a strategic, it should be a strategic priority, and this is not actually some side project that folks are doing just to feel good. And so there might be some helpful stuff in there if you're needing to help explain and rationalize for folks why you're taking the time for this, or even if you still have questions about that yourself, encourage you to take a look at what they wrote up, because that's a question that commonly comes up. So before we go on to the next part, seems like we should pause and see. We've got a few more minutes. These webinars normally go between an hour and 15 minutes to an hour and a half, so we've got a little bit of time if folks have questions or comments. And maybe, and we'll make sure to read the comments, because since they're not showing for everybody, George, only you and I and Alana are seeing these. So so when folks make a good comment to add in, we'll make sure that that gets said too. Let's see, and some of the questions that already were asked, I don't know if some of them have sort of been answered a little bit already, but Victor asked, I know many people of color, but I'm not certain how to bring up a topic that they may not be able to relate to. Was one question, and that was sort of tied into some other folks also asked about that. I mean, I think some of it is that, you know, we might have some homework to do, but hopefully some of the ideas around actually listening and asking questions rather than bringing it up and saying, hey, I have something that you need to know or you need to do or you need to be worried about or thinking about or concerned about, but rather, this is what I'm working on, and what do you think? And how do you think corporations affect you? And the other thing to remember, that not all people of color are necessarily interested in this. Just because they're people of color doesn't mean that they're necessarily interested in this. I mean, that would be true for white people too. So if you're talking about folks who are not at all engaged politically, and also not at all engaged, I don't mean politically in terms of electoral politics, but politically more broadly, there might be a little bit more work that's needed to do to connect this to their lives, and that would be true whether they're people of color or not. Which is why I would encourage folks to really think about making sure that organizations that are working for justice and economic justice in particular in your community are folks that you have relationships with, and if you don't have them, that you start to develop them, because they are natural allies. They are much more natural allies than the Tea Party or the Republican Party in a lot of ways. And so if you're, worrying about how to reach out to the Tea Party, I hope that you're also worrying about how to reach out to groups that are working against ICE and immigration policies that are racist and unfair, or folks who are, like we've mentioned a couple times, working against foreclosure, which is something that's hitting America everywhere, all over the place. And so, and there are folks that are already organizing on that. You might not know that they even exist yet, and you might need to do some detective work, but don't assume that there's not organizing happening. You just might not see it or be aware of it. Okay. I think of myself as somewhat socially inept, but your comments and advice are really encouraging to me. Thanks, Veronica. That's sweet. I'm glad to hear that this is helpful. And I think that some of this is taking it all together as a group also makes it easier. And even just taking some of those first steps and realizing that, hey, I can actually talk to folks and start to build relationships, that can be surprisingly daunting, and surprisingly, because after all, folks are just folks. But at the same time, these chasms have been built up and are really deep, and we help perpetuate them. And so taking the first step over them and even just starting to strike up a relationship can feel impossible or way too hard. But I think I have never found, when I tried, that it was as hard as I thought it was going to be, Imagine if a new group of folks came to you all and said, hey, we're interested in learning about what you're doing and how we can help. Would you be upset about that? Would you be weirded out? You'd probably be really encouraged and would welcome that. And that's probably the kind of response you're going to get, especially if you are being genuine about listening and offering that solidarity and support, and not trying to get them to do another task, which they already probably have a lot of already. And also keep in mind and remember that some of the groups that work with and represent communities of color can be really conservative politically in a lot of ways, like the NAACP, for example, can be really conservative depending on where you are. And so they might not be the most low-hanging fruit. They might not be the easiest place to get started. Not so much because of the race issues, but more just because of the political framework and perspective. And and also a lot of folks are really tied in with the Democratic Party and the status quo in a lot of ways. They're trying to be, and so doing some analysis and knowing who you're talking to ahead of time is important. George, looking at just skimming over the questions that we've gotten, is there anything that you would add?
No, I think you pretty much covered anything that I would say. I think folks are, got plenty to chew on. I want us to be able to be there to support people in the future. And I know Abraham's on the call, and in our education work group, one of the things that we'll be doing in future, and I don't imagine you'll have it in your hands before maybe the fall at the soonest, so September or October, but having educational materials that help connect the dots between the school-to-prison pipeline, or foreclosures and, what's going on in corporate issues. So I did want to name that. That's about all.
Cool. And if you find that you want materials sooner than that, feel free to get started and then send them our way. If there's issues in your community, especially as you start to develop these relationships, and then you have more fuel and information and facts and figures that folks can provide to you because they are tied into the work that they're already doing, certainly send them our way. And if it's a matter of laying them out in a pretty format, we might be able to help with that. Or we might, or if you have somebody in your group who could do that, we could just put it up and make it available to others. We're also working on a new set of materials that will also, and our goal is for those also to be in Spanish and for our brochure to be in Spanish too. So that's something that's in the works. And I would encourage folks to consider attending a convergence in an area near you, wherever your region's convergence is this year. If you go on the website, you can see the schedule. And we'll be in the Bay Area in July, and then the Midwest in August, and the East Coast in September. And then there's a couple other spots as well. And we do a little bit more time on this topic in those sessions as well, so that would be helpful. But remember, the first step is really to just take this back to your group, and I challenge or encourage you to maybe block off like half of your agenda, or maybe even your whole next meeting on this topic, and just talk about it. And if there are folks who have some concerns about whether this is relevant, then that's important for that to get out in the open and you to have a conversation about. So don't shy away from doing it. And if you run into stuff that makes you stumped, then let us know and we'll try to help you from there. Okay.
Thanks so much, everybody.
And everything, yeah. So there will be a survey a feedback evaluation survey at the end of the webinar. It will show up automatically when we close, so don't turn off your computer until that shows up. It will only take you a couple minutes, and we'd really appreciate it if you can fill it out. And the topic for next month, which is in just a couple weeks, will be determined. We got some good feedback on our call last night, so I will figure out what makes sense for us to do in June. And as always, feel free to touch base with us if you have any questions or additional longer feedback. So thanks, George, for doing this time.
Thanks to everyone. Take care.
Okay, and thanks, Alana, for helping with the questions. All right, I'm going to close this out, and the survey will pop up on your screen. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.